So this is our second media training. Today we're going to be focusing more on what it is like while we're working with the reporter and things to look for, things to ask, knowing our boundaries and so on and so forth. Mia has some great stuff prepared for us today. I do want to highlight tonight, I hope all of you can tune in. We are going to have a piece airing on NBC during the nightly news between 6:30 and 7:30. So we're hoping that you guys can tune in and watch that. There should be an article coming out simultaneously with it as well. And with that, again, thank you guys for joining in. It means a lot to us that you're here and that you're willing to lend your voice to the movement. And we will continue to do these things as long as they are helpful and as we identify the things that the community is coming to us asking for help with. So again, thank you guys for being here. Thank you to Mia, and I will hand it over to her.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Wonderful. So thanks, Karen, again for today, and thank you everyone for making time on your Sunday for this. Just a couple of things to start with. So again, I want to make a disclaimer that even though I am a communications and media professional, I am not here in any professional capacity or in any professional affiliation. Here as a volunteer, and none of the advice I'm giving today is coming to you through any of those professional affiliations. It's just some advice from me. So some housekeeping to start with. This presentation will take approximately 30 minutes. Followed by Q&A. To ask a question, please type it in the chat and we'll come back to it at the end. Please keep your question as concise and related to the presentation as possible so that we can get to as many questions as we can. And this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out afterwards. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get closed captioning up for this time, but we will have a transcript that goes out with the recording so that if you need closed captions, you'll be able to see the text that way. Okay, so what are we, just a reminder that this, this presentation is building on our last training 2 weeks ago, where we talked about how to understand messaging for public audiences, how to take your story, the information you want to convey, and turn it into a format that works for media interviews for public consumption. And so we're going to be building on that today, talking about the nitty-gritty brass tacks of what it means to talk to reporters, to be interviewed, and tips and practices that you'll need for that. I am going to be referring back to some things that we talked about last time, specifically around what it means to have a main message. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, or if you weren't able to join last time, please reach out to Karen for that recording. I'll recap a little bit, but it is helpful because we are going to be building on that one, that if you haven't seen it, to go ahead and watch that. So what are we going to cover in the next half hour? We're going to start with 3 practices for media interviews. Then we're going to talk about the group's process for fielding media requests, and then we'll have the opportunity for Q&A. And just to remind everyone that I've minimized the chat, I'm not going to be able to see it while the presentation is going on, but we will get to your questions at the end. Okay, so the 3 practices for media interviews. 1, prepare. 2, speak clearly and concisely, and 3, stay on message. And we'll go into all 3 of these. So to start out, remember that I just want to start with a few things to remember. We talked about these main messages and messaging in general as working on this behavioral change, starting with changing knowledge, public education, going to changing attitudes, and then building on that to change behaviors. And so we're going to be talking through how to actually do this in practice with a reporter. So some things to remember before we get into it. 1, you don't have to say yes to a reporter request, whether it comes directly from the reporter themselves or from the group leaders, you do not have to say yes. And so actually today, I'm going to be giving you tips to do it, but also giving you permission to sort of think differently about media requests and how these come in. So you don't have to say yes. And I just want to say that up front because, to take some of the pressure off for when a reporter may reach out, but also just in general. 2, you can have notes during an interview. You don't need to memorize everything. This isn't just for people who may be experiencing brain fog or other things like that. This is for anyone. You can have notes, and I don't want you to feel like that's something you can't. Number 3, you always want to check in with the C-19 LAP leaders when you get a press request before doing the interview. They should approve the interview and give you instructions. Because number 4, remember that when you're doing this, you're speaking as a member of the group and not just on your own behalf. So your main messages need to be in sync with the group. And I'll give Karen an opportunity to talk more about that at the end. So we talked about what it means to prepare your information, and I'm just going to reference back to that. Because folks are not going to be as knowledgeable about long COVID as you all are, having long COVID facts with you is going to be a really important part of this. If they have heard of it, they might have a glancing understanding, but it's not going to be the kind of in-depth knowledge that's needed to move them into changing attitudes and then into changed behaviors. And so bringing along with those main messages, long COVID facts is really important. This is why it's important to reach out to Karen, and I apologize for the siren. This is why it's important to reach out to Karen, to the other leaders, is because your main messages are going to come from the mission and the current advocacy initiatives of the group. And so we talked last time as one example about how to adapt your personal story to the central message that you're trying to convey. If the message you're trying to convey in the interview is that paid leave policies are really important for your state or at the national level, then you want to pull out parts of your personal story where you talk about you need time off work, or either as a patient or as a caregiver. And so it's really important to know what those current advocacy pieces and mission are ahead of time so that you can write out your main messages, your long COVID facts, and then the pieces of your own personal story that you're going to share as part of this. And when you're practicing and preparing your information, ask someone to listen to you and make sure that it's something that's easily understood. Talk it out with someone. The next piece of preparation is a list of questions to ask a reporter when they reach out. So they may offer up, without you having to ask, some of the information that you're going to try and get here. But if they don't, these questions are really important to understand to both evaluate the media opportunity and also to prepare for the interview itself. So the answers to these questions will help you decide whether or not this is something you want to do. And if the answer is yes, if it is, then they'll help you get prepared for the interview. So 1, is this call on background, on the record, or off the record? We're going to go into that in a second. 2, what is the format of this interview? So live means as you're talking, it's being broadcast in real time. Pre-taped means it's being recorded, and then it's going to be broadcast later, and usually not in its complete form. So that leads to the second question: how much of the interview will you use? The reason that's a good question to answer is that it helps you understand whether or not you have space to really expand your point, or you're trying to get your main messages in 1 or 2 short sentences. Because if you talk on the phone for 10 minutes, you record a 10-minute interview and they tell you they're only going to use 2 minutes of it, then you have in your mind, okay, I need my main messages to be really tight and clear so that I can make sure that those get in. I'm going to be aware that talking in full sentences is really important so that they can cut around a complete thought when they cut up the interview for the broadcasts later. So that's just something that will come with asking how much of the interview will you use. Where, when, and how will this story appear? So is it going to be on TV, on radio, on a website, a web-only story, or is it going to be in print? And that just gives you a sense of format, and you'll know whether you need to be on camera or how that's going to work. What is the goal of this story? So like we said, your main messages get tailored to the specific opportunity that you're doing. So is the story about the economic impact of long COVID? Is it for parents? Is it public education about what long COVID is? Let the reporter tell you what they're reporting, so then you're going to be able to better prepare and tailor your main messages and the part of your personal story that you want to pull out to the specific goals of the story that you're being interviewed for. When is your deadline? This is really important. Every reporter has a deadline, but it's not always right now. So this is to give you permission that when a reporter calls you, you don't have to answer right away, yes or no to the interview request. You also don't necessarily have to do that interview right then and there. You can take time to prepare. What if you ask what their deadline is and they say, oh, I have a week, then you know that you have time to talk with Karen or the other group leaders, decide if this is something you want to do, and then prepare and schedule the interview within that time. They might say, oh, I'm not on a deadline, I'm just researching and trying to get a sense of what this story is going to look like. Then you know that it's not going to be a recorded interview. You might not be on the record. We'll get to that. And so you have plenty of time. They might say, I'm on deadline, which means that they need an answer right now. But again, going back to our previous slide, you have permission to say no. You get to have this go on your timetable and at a pace that's comfortable for you. So if they have a deadline that doesn't work for you, either because it's right now or because the number of days they have to do the interview doesn't give you enough time to prepare based on how you're feeling at that moment, what else you have going on in your life, you can say no. You can say that deadline doesn't work for me. And so that's why talking with Karen and the other group leaders is also really important, because that helps them find someone who maybe would be able to meet the deadline if that's not you. And then how will the interview be conducted? So if it's TV, it's going to be over Zoom because they need the visual. But if it's not TV, then you might have the option to say, hey, can we actually do phone? That's more comfortable for me. Or if Zoom is more comfortable, you could try that too. Okay, so what are the terms of the interview? To talk through what these mean. On the record, that means everything you say can be used in the story and will be attributed to you by name. It means that the quote will be, the person who is speaking will be your name. Off the record, nothing you say can be used in the story, and there will be no appearance of your name in the story. On background, this is the one that's a little bit trickier. What this means is that the information that you're sharing with the reporter can be used either to inform their understanding of the story. So if they say to you in that example of, oh, I'm not on deadline, I'm just researching, I want to get some more information, this might be an example of when you're on background. They could also be, even if it informs the story, they might pull out things, they might describe what you said without giving it a direct quote. Or if there is a direct quote, it's not you by name, but it's a description that's agreed upon with the reporter. So a leader or a member of C-19 LAP, a long COVID patient, a caregiver. So on background is a more fluid negotiation that you decide with the reporter, which leads to the last point. The most important thing about these terms of the interview is that they must be agreed upon with the reporter out loud before you begin the interview. So that means when they call you and they say, okay, I just want to, talk, or when you start the interview, you say, can this be, if you want it to be off the record, can this be off the record? Pause, stop, and wait to hear them say, yes, this can be off the record, and then you start. Or can this be on background? Yes, this is on background. for attribution, not for attribution. If for attribution, I would like to be described as a leader of C-19 LAP. And they have to say, yes, that works. We'll do it on background, and I will characterize. The biggest mistake that people make with off record and on background, and not just people like you that, you know, may be new to media, but people that have done this a lot, is they say this is off the record. They don't wait for the reporter to confirm, and then they just barrel ahead. And what that means is that it's not actually off the record, and the reporter can use what you said on the record because you didn't wait for that agreement. So it's not like a sign, it's a contract, if you think about it that way. Okay, so moving into our next practice. When you're in the interview itself, speak clearly and concisely. Simply, the simple language, think about being understood with someone with no knowledge of long COVID. So again, you know, that is just really about, this is going to be new to a lot of people. And I think what's, you know, important is that a lot of people, as we talked about last time, we're trying to reach people who are inclined to be on your team. They just might not know as much about it. So just think about the way that you want to bring someone in. And that's going to be by speaking as simply as possible, using non-technical terms and plain language. I said this last time, but I want to repeat again that I know that for a lot of people with chronic illness and disability, a way of building your credibility of being listened to is to use medical language, and that gives you, you know, more standing in those interactions. But here, it actually serves to distance you from the audience and makes it harder for you to be understood. So instead of using a term like brain fog, you can describe what is happening. Instead of using a term like neuropathy or POTS, explain, describe it. I used to be able to do this, but now when I try to, X happens. Always go back to your main messages. Again, focusing on a few key points. I think that there's going to be a temptation for a lot of you that because we know and we feel like long COVID isn't getting as much attention as it should, that this is your one opportunity to throw everything at it. And that actually makes it harder to parse through and harder to understand. So just being clear about what the few main messages are and going back to those key points is going to be clear. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know the answer to that. That is fine. You are allowed. You are an expert on your own experience, but you don't have to be an expert on everything. So go on that point, stick to your own experiences unless you're quoting facts or information from the group. If they ask you to generalize, if they ask you to talk about all long haulers, a way to handle this is to say, well, I can only speak to my own experience, which is you are an expert on your story and your experience. I know that might not, a lot of you likely will have experienced being challenged, but this is really about owning your own experience and giving yourself permission to not have to try and speak for everyone. And then again, being calm and not rushed. So you have permission to pause and collect your thoughts, to go slower, to start your sentence over. So if you say, yeah, so what we, at C-19 LAP, what we're focused on, sorry, let me just take a step back there. I'm going to start again. So there is a community of long haulers that started an advocacy group. See what I mean? That's an example. You're allowed to do that. You're also allowed to ask the reporter to repeat the questions or clarify them if you don't know. This happens on your terms. And so you don't have to feel boxed in to something that you're not comfortable with. Practice number 3, staying on message. Remember here that this is not a regular conversation. This isn't the goal of a media interview, is to communicate your messages, to get your main messages across. So in this interview, you want to repeat your main message with every question they ask. It's unlikely they're going to challenge you. I know that you've been, challenged by family or friends or strangers on Facebook or even doctors, but they are talking to you because they want to hear your story. And so this isn't about coming from a place of defensiveness. It's coming from a place of making sure that you can communicate your main messages. So there are 3 techniques for staying on message that I want to go through: blocking, bridging, and flagging. Blocking. This is about setting boundaries as to what you will answer. Some examples. Let's look at this from a broader perspective. Well, I can only speak to my experience, which is that I've had to take a lot of time off work, and I hope that I'll be able to go back. But the thing about long COVID is that it's unpredictable, and there's no way to know if my symptoms will subside enough for me to be able to do that. Let's not lose sight of the underlying issue. Bridging. This is going from your answer and returning to your main message. Think about crossing a bridge and your main message is on the other side. That's a great question. What's important to remember is, keep in mind, there's more to the story of lower case counts. Yes, cases overall are going down, but there are still millions of people that are living with COVID, and we need to be thinking about them in our policies going forward. And then flagging. Making your main message clear. Flagging is using language to point a giant neon sign. This is my main message. This is really important. Flagging is especially helpful if you're doing broadcast interviews, meaning TV or radio, because when a producer is packaging, when they're cutting down the segment, when they're listening to the recording and thinking about how they're going to use it, that cues them to say, oh, this is important, I should include this. But it's helpful because it's a helpful tool no matter what kind of interview you're doing. So the most important thing is, what we really want to make clear is that there are people who are going to be living with COVID potentially for years. Another example, something we can't lose sight of in the conversation about people wanting the pandemic to be over is that for millions of people with long COVID, the pandemic isn't and won't be over even when we loosen masking restrictions, right? So you see what I'm doing there with those key phrases that set you up to make your main message. So a summary. Number one, just to summarize all of this, and again, you're going to have these, sorry about that, you're going to have these slides. So one, coordinate with the leadership before you commit to an interview. 2, prepare your story and talking points in advance. 3, ask questions in advance of the interview to understand the purpose. Ask questions of the reporter in advance to understand the purpose of the interview. When you're in an interview, be clear and concise, answer in brief, complete sentences. Repeat your points and bridge back to your main message if necessary. And again, feel free to go slowly, pause, or ask for a question to be repeated. Okay, now I wanted to, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I wanted to just toss it to Karen to give her an opportunity to talk through what the process should look like and what the leadership wants you all to do if you get a media request.
Thank you, Mia. That was awesome. And when you guys get a media request, it also depends on like what form it comes to you in. Did you write something on Twitter where they're contacting you independently, or are you answering a media request that we posted in the group or on our page or from our Twitter, making a call for media requests? So if you happen to post something and a journalist reaches out to you, by all means, you can tell your story without necessarily involving the group, though we would love and appreciate you to involve us. And obviously, even if you don't intend to do that, we want to make sure that the right messaging is getting out. So we are more than happy to talk you through some of the recent data, some of the recent trends, some of the recent things that we've been asking for with our lawmakers. So don't be afraid to reach out to us no matter what form of media request it comes from. If it's something that comes from us, I know we talked about this a little bit last session, is vetting the reporter and vetting the story and their interest in it. That's super important to make sure that we're not working with people who might have an idea, this idea that long COVID is psychosomatic or anxiety driven. And there's been plenty of op-ed opportunities that people have written that about that journalists then follow up on. So just vet who's approaching you, vet where the request came from, and then do a little bit of research on your own, like with us, asking us what are the relevant things, what are the topics that we're trying to nail in the head right now with long COVID that we're trying to get across. So if you guys are approached separately, you can come to myself or Anne. We both put our emails into the chat. If you're comfortable doing it on your own, or even if the reporter asks you, hey, do you know anybody else? Please come to us so that we can find you the right person for the story, especially if it's like, national versus state specific, because a lot of the state groups are sometimes easier to find than national volunteers, ironically. But the most important part, I think, of the gist of this is talk to Anne and I, figure out what are the happenings in the community, what are our main goals and acts that we must get out there, and then relate your issues and your story to those key asks. And that's what Mia was kind of talking about in flagging your main points before the story with the reporter, ensuring what they're asked, what is their storyline? Does your story and the community's goals even align with their storyline? And so on and so forth. And not to be like super negative or anything, but like if a reporter came to you saying, I want to do a media story on how great these post-COVID care centers are, I think everybody on this call would probably laugh. I mean, we know that they're not great and they're failing us. So sometimes as the patient and the person being reported on, you're also kind of responsible for flagging misinformation and for correcting them and pointing them in the right direction, and therefore educating on some of these issues. So not to be like overwhelming or anything like that, but like it's important. Take your breath, take your time, think about how you would contribute to the story, aligning with the community's goals and vetting where this is coming from. And did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it. And sorry, I just got a phone call, so I missed a little bit of it, but yeah. But I think that all sounded good to me.
Cool.
The other thing I wanted to add just about like the messaging and relating back to the advocacy project's messaging is that I know as a long hauler, for almost 2 years now, that it's tempting every single time we start talking about long COVID to talk about our symptoms, because we're like, I want you to believe me. And we're so desperate for people to believe us every single time. And so it's like, you need to know how bad this is. And so every single time I'm talking about long COVID, I'm going to bring up my symptoms. But it's really important to make sure that you're only doing that in the context of whatever the message is in that interview. And the messaging depends on who the audience is. So we talked about last time, I think we talked about like, or maybe this was a couple conversations ago, like talking to, if you're talking to the audience is parents. And so we're talking about masking in schools or vaccine requirements in schools, then like you can talk about your symptoms, but I think it's actually, if you're an adult, it's more powerful to get from the group's list of talking points, what are the symptoms experienced by pediatric long haulers, and talk about, you can talk about losing your job, but if you're an adult and we're talking about schools, look for talking points that relate to what is the education loss that pediatric long haulers experience. So it's like, I know that we're all eager to have people finally listen to us and believe us, but we really have to make sure that we're doing that inside the context of the message, and the message is dependent on who the audience is.
100%. And just to feed off something you said is when we're talking about our symptoms, we feel like if we don't include that, like we're not letting people know how severe it is. I'm trying to turn the messaging a little bit more towards like the reporter is going to ask you about your symptoms regardless. They love doing that. But the better messaging at this stage, 2 years in, is this is the level of disability I face. Here's how it affects my daily living. Here's the trouble I'm having navigating the medical system and accessing benefits. And then you can get into, I don't understand why it's such a hard process. And I have 10 new chronic conditions because of COVID-19 that's caused long COVID, and go into things like that. But I think it's super important to realize that you don't have to necessarily name the symptoms. And like Mia said before, like when you're throwing out terms like dysautonomia and POTS and so on, like I do that all the time because I'm a science-driven person and was in the medical world. So it's natural for me. For you guys, it's not natural. So if they put you on the spot for a TV interview and you don't know how to explain it or something like that, it doesn't always necessarily look great. So don't feel like if you're not talking specifics about your symptoms, you're not getting the severity across, because you can talk about how, like, you know, they said before, what were you able to do pre-COVID? What are you not able to do now? Or like, being in bed 85% of the time, not being able to drive anymore, you know, not being able to work, so on and so forth. Those are the things that I think paint the true story. And when it's somebody like me who I can say, I'm at 2 years, this is not a 2-week cold or flu, this is not getting better. For me, many of these things are getting worse. I think that's a really strong talking point to tell people, because I still don't think people realize how long many of us have been suffering with this for. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there too.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and I
Karen.
think that would be an opportunity to expand on your personal experience. I know that for this group specifically, there are people at all points in their long haul journey that are part of the group versus like the long haul fighters round 1, 2, 3, whatever. Like those are going to be people who got sick at the exact same time as you. If you're someone who's hasn't been sick for as long and it's relevant, I think it's fair to say, you know, I've had symptoms for this long. I've been sick for this long. There are millions of people who got sick at the beginning of the pandemic and are still sick today and are actually getting worse every single day. So you can like throw it to people that you know, even if you haven't experienced it, but you're not necessarily talking about their experience.
That was something I was going to suggest, that if something is not exactly applicable to you, but you know that you have a version of it or something like it, I'll give you an example here. So for instance, I had a year of sick leave, which meant that I did not face like, you know, financial devastation the way that so many long haulers have. But when I say that, I couch that as I am fortunate enough to work for a state university with a very generous sick leave policy so that I was able to take a year of paid sick leave. However, that sick leave is now up and I am back at work and blah, 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 blah. But so even though I'm not one of the people that is facing, you know, who's losing my home, et cetera, I try to put this situation within the context of I completely understand how other people are, that I'm lucky. So if you can connect your story, or I'm unlucky, depending on what your story is, right? Or if you can make those connections between different experiences, I think it's helpful. Or it's one way I've approached it, at least.
And one other thing I would just add is, like Anne was saying, like when you're thinking about someone else's story, after the interview, you don't have, especially if this is being recorded, or you can say off the record, you can always say, by the way, would you like me to connect you to the person I was thinking of or the person I was talking with? And you can hear from them. And I can't tell you how many media stories I've done because they've talked to somebody else who told them about me, or I've told them about somebody and then connected them to somebody else. So I think like the networking aspect of this and bringing in all the different kind of portions of long COVID and the different experiences of long COVID to paint that comprehensive picture that we all really want out there is super important. And so just, you know, I think we all are very familiar with each other's stories. I think, unfortunately, but at the same time, nicely, we've all kind of been talking with each other for a year or 2 years within the groups and sharing our experiences. So I think it's super beneficial that, you know, we understand one another, and we also might know what the other person is capable of doing as well. Like, are they up to a media story right now? You know, are they okay with public speaking? Do they have legal issues going on that they wouldn't be even interested in this for? So knowing your surroundings, knowing your people, knowing your crowd, and connecting one another is also really important in this.
Thank you all. I want to underline what Karen just said. There is nothing a reporter is going to love more than, oh, I know someone else you should talk to. So that helps. You're doing them a favor because you're helping them with their reporting. So I would say, instead of trying to capture someone else's story in full, say, like, have like one sentence for someone who has experienced like dysautonomia and can really speak to that part of it. One sentence for someone who is caring for some, like a child or a teenager, and can speak to that. Like, just one sentence, just so you're not like having to, like, as I said, like, the most important thing is to speak about your experience. It's actually not helpful for them to, like, for you to like go on and on about someone else's, because for the purpose of in order to include it in their story, eventually they're still going to have to talk to that person. They're not going to be able to quote you talking about someone else without confirming that those are things that are true. So just think about, like, I have an idea for someone else you can talk to. I think that's a really good tactic. The other thing I will say about symptoms is that the goal of the goal of talking to these reporters is to demonstrate the impact of long COVID. What does it mean for your daily lives? And then in a larger, like, global sense, what does it mean for the country, for the economy? Pick your thing to have millions of people suffering with long COVID. So while it may seem like listing like a litany, like a big list of symptoms helps you do that, it actually is more helpful to describe your daily life, to describe the impact that the symptoms have had. Like, I can no longer stand up or walk to the front door to get the mail without feeling faint. Like, as opposed to like whatever the medical terms are for that experience. Like, it's actually going to help someone. We talked about this last time. Our brains are primed for stories. We remember things better. There's research that shows that we remember facts and details better when they're presented to us in the form of a story, because it's a pattern that our brains understand. So in addition to, like, think about like the best, like, just we're not saying don't share your symptoms. We're saying package them in a story of the impact that they've had for you. Okay, I'm going to scooch to the chat and just see that I'm looking for any questions. Okay. It sounds like yes. Good way to find media opportunities. Follow the Facebook group. Karen, are there other ways that do you have like an email list or other things that people should get on for finding media opportunities?
We do have a media sign up list. So like, if you're interested in media opportunities, you would basically fill out this form, and when we had opportunities, we would push this form out. But usually every time we get media opportunities, we post them on the group page. So the group, not the page, sorry, the group. And it's hard because like I would love for Facebook to notify all of you anytime like our group posts or I post on the group as an admin, so that you guys get notified about these things and can say, oh, there's a media opportunity, I want to participate, instead of having to dig through the page. So if we have a large media request, it goes on our group and our page, and we would be emailing out our form of the people that contacted as well. If it is a state specific request, we will also post it in the main group, but then go post it in that state specific group. And for those of you, if you're on this call that don't know, we have 51 state groups that include DC and several special populations groups. So for educators, first responders, pediatrics. So if you go onto our Facebook page, on the banner at the top, you'll see COVID-19 Long Hauler Advocacy Project. You click that, takes you to our page. You click on groups and go join your state group or your special populations group, so you don't miss any of those as well. And the state groups are also beneficial too, because if you have any specific local research going on, or post-COVID care centers, or potentially recover sites opening up, you guys will get that information more locally than you will in the national group per se. So definitely check all of those out. But it's a process, and we would love to build our media list. That's what we're kind of hoping to do here. And I'll be quite frank, is we get a lot of opportunities, but we unfortunately don't have enough volunteers to fill them some of the times, which hurts us. So we're really calling on some of you guys, and it's part of why we're doing this media training, is because we felt like some of that, besides being sick, is just not knowing what to do and being uncomfortable and being worried, and having like anxiety towards like, I'm going to be on TV, or I'm going to be in the media, I'm going to be quoted. So we want you guys to feel comfortable, and we want to give you some of the skills and tips to do that. So thank you, Mia.
Yeah, absolutely. On the question about pitching, I actually would recommend not pitching stories. One, because it sounds like it's not necessary. Like what Karen is saying is that they have more requests coming in than they can fill. So actually going out and finding new media opportunities isn't necessary at this point. The other thing is that when you're pitching, it's like a whole other practice to that. And you also want to make sure that like, you know, other people that are emailing reporters. So I would say not necessarily to pitch. The one exception, like if you see someone who you think would be a really good reporter to cover this, because you saw an article they wrote, because you saw their tweeting about it, I would shoot Karen and the group an email and say, hey, are you guys in touch with this reporter? And like, I saw this thing, like, would be great if they were on our media, if they were on our list of reporters. And that's just how I would build out the group. Yeah, no need to start pitching reporters. This is just about how to be ready to be called on when there's a media request that comes in. Great point from Karen there too, in the chat. Any other questions about talking to reporters, being interviewed, other things like that?
Mia, maybe you can just give a couple of more examples of the like bridging, blocking, flagging that you talked about before, or like if anyone has ideas of like, you know, Mia, how do you bridge this thing? Maybe like put them in the chat, and then Mia can give some real-time examples of like what that sounds like.
Yeah. Are there questions that you've gotten, or are there issues that you're not sure how you would think about those? Let me go back to this page. Share my screen again. So I'm just gonna see if I can pull up this chat so I can keep an eye on it. Great, okay. So if we're talking, I know that the State of the Union having the president talk about long COVID in the State of the Union is really important. So if someone were to ask you, you know, if they said, well, you know, an example is like, I'm trying to make this smaller so you guys aren't missing any of the words. Here we go. So, you know, well, President Biden is going to talk about COVID. Like, you know, aren't there more people who are, you know, isn't it more important that he talk about the number of people that have lost family members, or like we have, you know, all these kids that have now lost caregivers? Like, how can he, you know, there's a lot going on. Like, why is it important that he mentioned long COVID, like specifically, like, you know, out of all of the things? So here I would, you know, look at, you know, I think there's a few ways that you could go about it. Let's not lose sight of the underlying issue, which is that we are not going to be able to get the, you know, to get the workforce that people want back at work while millions of people are not able to work. You know, let's look at it from a broader perspective. We can't talk about winning a war on COVID, you know, when millions of people still have it. You know, we don't, what we really want to make clear is that we are not in competition with people who've been impacted by the loss of a loved one, the loss of a caregiver. It's not about who is impacted by COVID worse. It's about making sure that we're not leaving anyone behind when we talk about how to come out of this pandemic. Yes, hospitalization numbers are going down, but there's more to the story. It's really about hospitalization numbers and case numbers only tell part of the story. And there's more to the story, which is that there are millions of people still living with COVID and whose lives have been changed because of it. Are there other, thinking about like other, issues?
I was going to jump in, if you don't mind, and give one more example of, like, right now, I can imagine reporters asking about the CDC's changed, relaxing of mask mandates. And I can easily imagine that being a question if we have an interview of what do you think of what the CDC is doing regarding, lifting mask mandates, about them not being required on airplanes and public transportation beginning in mid-March or whenever that is. I might have the details of that wrong. And that's not what we're here to talk about, right? So like, that's a question I would definitely want to be bridging off of, and link it right back to what that risk is for long COVID, for people developing long COVID.
Yeah, that's a really great one. I'm so glad you brought it up. Okay, so what do you think about the CDC's changing mask mandates? Great question. What's important to remember is that there are millions of people who, because of long COVID, will always be more susceptible, and that focusing on allowing us to return to normal is not available to people who have long COVID. And so what we want is for all of the government's guidelines, not just about masking, but about funding and about research and about medicine, to keep long haulers in mind. So another way to approach that. What do you think about the new mask mandate? Well, I can only speak from my experience, which is that I actually am not, like, I will be masking because I am not able to protect myself because of long COVID. And so when we ask people to keep masking, it's not because we want to keep everyone back in the pandemic. It's because we're trying to, make sure that everyone's protected. What I really want to make clear is that when we are just talking about case counts, hospitalizations, if we're masking or not masking, we are just talking about only people that are well, and we're ignoring people with long COVID. And so we just need to broaden the conversation to make sure that all of these guidelines are including people with long COVID. So that's a couple ways to approach that. Build Back Better bill had benefits for caregivers. Yes, I can give some examples. I'm only laughing because this from my other life. How the bill would improve lives for people disabled by COVID. Yeah, so one of the things that the Build Back Better bill provided for is increased funding for people to have home-based long-term care versus like a nurse or someone to come into their home, instead of either paying for it themselves, which can be exorbitantly expensive, or going into what's called a congregate care setting, a nursing home, independent living, something like that. So, so what I would say for that one is that the bill includes funding for people to be able to get the care they need in their own homes, rather than paying for it out of pocket, which can be prohibitively expensive, or going into a setting like a nursing home that we have seen makes people who are already immunocompromised especially susceptible to illness that is really easy to pass around there. You could also say it allows people to get long COVID. It allows people to get home-based care and get off of waiting lists, which they may spend years on. So when the government increases the funding to hire more caregivers and raises the wages of those caregivers, there are more people, and people who've been waiting for years don't have to keep waiting. Something like that. Yeah. Just looking at, lack of masks result in COVID and long COVID. So like, so specifically on the mask question, why are you worried about the masking? Well, what's important to remember is that when we talk about things like loosening mask guidelines, we're thinking short term. We're not thinking we're not thinking in a long-term perspective of how many more people might get COVID or might get more severe COVID that could either way could result in long COVID, and will eventually keep those people from being able to work. So by prioritizing people getting back to work or opening restaurants now, we might actually make it harder in the long term for the economy to recover. Another example. Stop the share.
I was just thinking of another question that might be asked based on recent news, which is that article that came out in the Cell, I think it was, or Cell, maybe it's called, regarding 4 potential risk factors for developing long COVID, and that's getting a lot of press. And so it might be something to think about if you get asked, well, now that we have some understanding of what kinds of people develop long COVID, why do we have to worry about everyone else? Or why can't we drop mask mandates and the people who are at risk can go live under a rock? Whatever, they wouldn't say it that way, but questions of that nature. And I would just maybe be prepared for that. I'm a person who has MS, so I've been asked since the beginning of since I first got COVID, well, shouldn't you have expected to have been susceptible to long COVID, to develop long COVID or severe COVID? And that's always a tricky question because, yes, I did have my eye on it for that reason. From the minute I found out I had COVID, my doctor immediately said I might have a more severe case, et cetera. But we also know that perfectly healthy people have developed long COVID. So I always try to bridge that back to, yes, but we see teenagers developing long COVID. My own teenager has long COVID. I try to bridge it back that, yes, I was worried about myself, but it's not just about me and my risk factor.
Totally. And that's a really great, bridging. That's a really good example that Anne is saying of talking about your own story and bridging it back to your main point. So, Anne's story is, listen, I'm someone who had MS already, who had a chronic illness. But what we want to be clear about is that there's no way to predict who might end up as a long hauler, and that there are people who are healthy, who are teenagers, marathon runners, who are getting long COVID. I understand. I'm just, parking a lot that we've talked about, like the good patient, the ideal patient. So I don't want to, step in that for a second, but to the point, the point being, yes, like in my experience, I was always worried about it because I was immunocompromised before the pandemic began. But what we want to make clear is that anyone can end up with long COVID. And if we're going to make sure that we're protecting everyone and not just, asking people who are immunocompromised to protect themselves, then we need mitigation measures that take everyone into consideration. So you're seeing like going from Anne's story back to your main message.
And that's when I might throw in the statistic of, a conservative number is that 10% of people develop long COVID, but we know that is, unlikely. It's most likely more like 30%. And that the CDC even predicts that only 1 in 4 long COVID cases is being counted. So then I would throw back some of the statistics and to make it clear, it's not just immunocompromised folks.
I think
definitely. And that's the kind of thing. Hold on, Rebecca. That's the kind of thing that Anne would have on her notes before the interview. So she would say, like, immunocompromised. She put a bullet that talks about anyone can end up with long COVID. Then she'd write out on her notes, 1 in 4, undercounting, all of those. Anne has them in her head, but not everyone needs to. And in fact, no one needs to, because you'll be able to have notes in front of you.
And I will say, before every interview that I have, I look up our current case count, and then I do the math of what's 30% of that, or, then I start breaking it down. And I write it on a notepad next and leave it next to me when I'm being interviewed. So I definitely always have a cheat sheet of the statistics.
Sorry, Becca, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. So it kind of the thing I was thinking of is that it kind of relates to what Kathy just in the chat about when folks ask me why I'm so worried about dropping the mask mandate in schools. I'm an educator. Since I can be the one wearing a mask, I remind them that as a COVID survivor, I'm on supplemental oxygen, which gets us there without a mask. Usually takes the question a minute to process. So I was just also thinking, as we were talking about Anne and people's argument of people who are immunocompromised and have underlying conditions can just stay home. Another talking point that you could hit is that only accounts for people who were immunocompromised, or if you want to not use that word, who had underperforming immune systems. It's easier for them to get sick, or they'll get sicker if they're exposed to something. It only accounts for those who were like that before COVID. And so I think you can also say people who had zero underlying conditions as a result of COVID, it has caused permanent changes to their immune system, and they are now immunocompromised, or now more susceptible to illness in a way that they weren't before. So if we're thinking about how to get everyone back to work, if you look at how many people have had changes to their immune system as a result of COVID and therefore would have to stay home, if we have more people staying home if they're going to get sick, then it's actually a lot fewer people able to return to work at the full capacity than you would think. So I think talking about, maybe that's a way to bridge or pivot. That's not a word that Mia used, but talking about them saying well, what about, everyone with underlying conditions, everyone who was sick with COVID before can just stay home, then you can bridge to the impact of COVID, because so many of us are now more susceptible because of COVID.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Okay, well, it is 4:59, and I don't want to go over time and ask more of you all. So just wanted to kick it to Karen to close us out.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to continue doing these, types of trainings and sessions. I would love for all of us to be able to branch out and maybe help another 1 or 2 people when it comes to some media training, and pulling them into these meetings. But I think everything that we hit on today is super important. And I think it's more so important to know that you guys have control over your interview. And I think that calms a lot of nerves, and knowing that, you're not marching to their beat, they're marching to yours. You can say, I don't want to do this, or I can talk about ABC, but not X, Y, and Z. You can stop the interview at any point. So I think understanding that and knowing that is powerful for the patient or the person who's participating in the interview, because it's not always going to be the patient. It might be your child or your spouse, or somebody who sees you experiencing these issues every day that they also wish to interview. So again, even those people, if you get pulled into an interview and they're like, I'm very nervous, I don't know what to do, we're more than happy to work with you guys and talk with them as well, not just you guys as members. We want to make sure that we're helping everybody and get the right messaging out. So again, thank you guys for joining us on a Sunday. Again, this will be up, give us a couple days, we'll be up on our YouTube channel, along with the first session. If you haven't seen that, that's up there as well. And I sent that out as the link out to you guys in the reminder email for this meeting last night. And pay attention, look for the media requests. And again, flagging that we have an NBC piece tonight that we've kind of been working on for a month and a half with them. So between 6:30 to 7:30 tonight, that will air. And a big reason that, you know, we wanted to emphasize some of this today as well is that we anticipate there to be more, you know, media requests and questions that come from this piece from NBC as well. So we will be reaching out to you guys probably sooner rather than later, trying to match you with a reporter, match you with a request, and so on and so forth. So what I will do, probably not today, today has been a very rough day, but by tomorrow or the next day, I will send out the email with the session link for the 1 and 2 that were done. I'll send out the media sign up form, and then a brief reminder of how you guys locate the state group pages as well, so you can get connected on there. And did you want to say anything? Cool. So
No,
again,
but somebody did ask, was tonight airing Eastern time? I believe so,
yes,
right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I
6:30,
think she said it's airing Eastern time, but I think she said it's still an hour later Central time or something like that. And there's also an article that's supposed to simultaneously be coming out with it as well. So we will share all of that on the group when we have it, and on Twitter. And again, thank you guys. Like our movement doesn't move forward without your voices and your involvement. So we deeply appreciate all of you being here tonight and lending your time and helping one another move forward.
Thank you all.